So welcome to Equiano Project Live. So today we're going to be talking about Black History Month. And the theme of this Black History Month, but I don't know who actually organizes the themes. I mean, that's another interesting one. But the theme, apparently for this year's Black History Month, is Saluting Our Sisters, which is about celebrating the exceptional achievements of Black women. So the Equiano Project, we thought that we would jump on this discussion too, as we are a platform to celebrate, engage with a wide range of diverse and heterodox ethnic minority voices. We've brought together three amazing Black women on the panel. And we want to dive into many of the questions around Black History Month. Is it still needed? Is it identity politics? Is it relevant? Is it biased in some ways? So we've brought together some very, very exciting guests. We have Kidology, and she is a YouTuber and video essayist writing on culture, modern society, and identity politics. We also have Patient Xina, a YouTuber and social commentator who discusses a variety of topics related to modern culture. Of course, we have Ada, social commentator, writer, and content officer at the Equiano Project, and myself, Inaya Folarin Iman, who's a broadcast journalist, and I'm also the founder and director of the Equiano Project. So firstly, just thank you all. Hello, everybody.
So excited to be here.
So for all of you who may not know about our guests, we will have all of their links in the description box. So please do find out a lot more about their work, lots of fascinating ideas and perspectives on many of these issues. So I guess I want to get straight into it. As I said, you can find out more about our guests in the description box. The first question that I want to ask everybody is Black History Month still relevant? So let's start with you, Kidology. What do you think of Black History Month?
Personally, I don't think it's relevant. I don't think it really ever was terribly relevant. I feel that it was, at least in the context of Britain, just an import from the US here. I think that when it comes to sort of even the list of 100 great historical Britons, that was even originally, at least in like 2003, established by a white woman. And some of the people on that list, it isn't even really consensual that they were actually Black. They sort of are on the list, even though the concept of race had not actually been formulated in the way that we understand it today to refer to some of these people. So it doesn't necessarily feel terribly genuine to this idea of a month to celebrate Blackness and what that actually means. It feels far too political and just does not feel terribly relevant beyond just being a political sort of sanctimonious venture.
No, that's a really interesting perspective. I definitely want to get into that later. I mean, this whole idea of race itself, like, is Black History Month really entrenching, racial divisions? Because presumably we don't want a month, we don't want history to be defined on racial terms. So does that kind of solidify it? Does that institutionalize it? What are your thoughts, Patience? Do you think that it's still relevant?
I think Kidology I agree with Kidology's point that I do think it's an American import. I think that in Britain, we do have a bad tendency of just copying and importing American things when it comes to things like Black History Month and also like a ton of other movements as well that we've kind of adopted. I think we should teach this history as just history. I don't think it should be segregated and separated. And the idea of having like a month as well, to me, is just a bit bizarre. I think it would make much more sense to just teach history with all the other history subjects that we teach, because we don't only learn about British history when we learn history, we also learn about German history when we learn about the Holocaust, we learn about all these other histories of other countries, but we don't feel the need to segregate them and make them their own thing. I think that we can incorporate Black history or whatever we're referring to when we speak about that within general history lessons, and just talk about it that way, because obviously the British Empire does have a past in African countries, etc. So I don't see why you have to segregate it. I think you can kind of talk about it as like a general history subject.
Ada, I mean, what do you say to those who say, well, Black history or the history of those that are racialized as Black and are ethnic minorities was ignored, was marginalized. We weren't hearing about the stories of those voices that are very much part of the long history of Britain. I mean, the Equiano Project is named after Alauda Equiano, a British Nigerian abolitionist and former slave. And oftentimes, you really have to dig deep to find those stories of Black Britons in the past, and therefore it is still relevant.
Yeah, I think that's why I can understand why some people may feel it is relevant for them, because they may feel that their histories, their in quotation marks, has been either hidden or reframed as so-called white history, or as you mentioned, has been marginalized. But I think in that case, as sort of Patience kind of mentioned, then the initiative shouldn't be to then sort of separate out another, 1 month just to kind of, dig up those lost stories and sort of reintroduce, those hidden, let's say, narratives to the public conversation. I think it should be more naturally done. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these things aren't natural. So when I think about this question, I think, what is the exact purpose of Black history? Okay, you hear the main things are to celebrate, right, Black culture, which is another problematic thing in itself, right? These kind of terminology are meant to kind of, bring a sense of pride, within the community that has been marginalized. But then is it actually fulfilling that purpose? And if it is, then how can we see that there are actually lower levels of sort of national pride, within those communities? So I think it doesn't serve the actual purpose because of the way and because of, how it's been done and the method that it's been done. And I think if we do incorporate it naturally, as British history, then it will remove that divisive element of it. Sorry, just one last quick thing. When I hear a lot of, these, intellectuals or sort of historians make that point, on one hand, well, it is British history, but then in the same breath, they will say something like, so we should teach Black history so that children should be proud of their heritage and they should be proud of, their historical stories. So is it a unified thing or isn't? It can't be both.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, my thoughts on it is that I'm kind of ambivalent. Like, when it's done, like, I don't think, yeah, no, this is really recognizing my heritage. This is really recognizing, my ancestors. I'm just like, this kind of doesn't really have much relationship to me. And I feel British. I am British, and I feel like the country's history and heritage is my own. And it speaks to me when we're talking about World War One and Two. If we're talking about and much further than that. But my worry, in particular now with Black history, is that I even worry that there's almost a exaggeration slightly of the role that some Black people played within history. Is almost an attempt, and I think that you made a bit of a video about it on Instagram, Ada, this attempt to almost say that Britain has always been this like multicultural, racially diverse kind of haven since
yeah.
Like,
are you referring to the song, the history song where they said that we built the things that we didn't?
Yeah. And I'm like, why do you need to be like imposing that? Like, why do you have to almost rewrite history in order to make people feel happy about the way that Britain is today? You don't need to do that. It's just the way that society has changed. I think that is quite dangerous, the way that that's happening. I don't know if other people have thoughts on it.
I think that's something that's kind of happening across different things. I think I can't remember which show was it that did the history song and said that Black people. Do you remember which one it was? I can't remember the name of it.
It was like a BBC.
I think it was a BBC bite size or something.
Yeah. I think
Mm.
this is something that's happening across media, though, because we see it happening with that. We also saw it with the Black Cleopatra, and the brace swapping of all these other historical figures and stuff. It's almost like rewriting history and putting Black people in positions that aren't historically theirs, in a way to try and make them feel I guess, to feel included or to feel part of it. And I do find it to be quite bizarre, because I don't think you need to do that. You don't need to rewrite and, you know, make things up in order to make people feel included, or in order to make people feel as though they're just as interesting. I think there's other ways to do it. It's just the way that they choose to go about it. If anything, it kind of, I do feel it's a bit patronizing, because it kind of implies that we don't have anything interesting of our own, so we have to take from other cultures, we have to take from other people.
No, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah,
and I
I
also
agree.
think we have to Oh, sorry, go for it, Ada.
No, just one quick point. And I think the danger of that is that you see this kind of reactionary trend that I'm seeing going on a lot. I don't know if you guys have seen. So I've seen we might even have mutual followers. I've seen kind of these YouTube accounts, I won't name names now, and in order to kind of reclaim their story, so they may be, you know, British or white and whatever. So you see a big, massive pushback of, no, they absolutely could not have been Black because of the skull sizes. And we're going back to these kind of rhetoric and scientific racism terminology, right? Because, yeah, like you mentioned, Patience, it's like it's forced. It's like we're trying to rewrite and squeeze ourselves into certain stories instead of actually exploring, you know, maybe hidden and untold stories of our own. And as long as this continues, we will see that pushback, you know, become heavier. And that's certainly something I don't want to see.
But just quickly, like, I think, but the thing is, when we took so-called white history, which isn't white history, it's just history, is also our history. Like the history of democracy in this country, the history of like the Magna Carta, the history of like the kings and queens, that is the history of British people. It's not a race-based history. And so that is another problem with it. It's suggesting to the young Black and ethnic minority kids growing up that actually the only history in this country are the history of Black people, when that's not true. It's the history of British people, to which that's their stories as well. And I just think that it then feeds into, I think, a further sense of otherness, because you're not going to find all these Black people in the past. And if you're defining your self-worth and your identity on that, then you're going to fall short, because that's just not the way that the story is.
I agree. And I think as well, if they took your approach, it would be a lot more unifying, and you'd probably have more young Black people who feel, who, as Ada said, a lot of young Black people don't feel proud to be British. And I think this is probably some of the stuff that's playing into it, because when you continue to other them and make them feel as though like this is not their history, this is white people's history, and then they have their 1 month in October for their history, it does create that divide. Whereas if you focus more on the national identity and focus on the fact that on their Britishness, which is something that would unify all of them, and then focus on the history of Britain, which they are all a part of as British citizens, I think you would find a way to unify them more on that. And also, you don't need to focus on the skin color of these historical figures. You just need to understand their stories to understand, you know, why Britain looks the way it does today. Their skin color is not really relevant, to be honest. You know, it's just an added detail about their description, but it's not really the most important thing about them. When I think about Henry VIII, I don't really think about his skin color. I think about the fact that he executed his wives. These details are not really that important. I think that we are hyper focusing on unimportant details as opposed to the actual story and the historical significance of these people.
No, it's so true. I mean, on that same point, I'd be really interested in your thoughts, Kidology, about, do you think Black History Month is identity politics?
Yes, definitely. Yes, I do think that it is political. I think that it serves a purpose for a lot of high profile, we could say, sort of, I guess, white elites to feel like they are doing something. I think it serves a political purpose for politicians to definitely try and connect with a diverse electorate. And I think that it's got more allegiance to the politics of the matter and the zeitgeist of sort of inclusivity that we live in, which allows you to rewrite history as somehow being inclusive when it's perfectly fine that history was not, and that this is a modern thing, in order to make a statement, in order to feel good. I think it isn't accurate to sort of the realities of even history just being made every second of every day, of the diversity of Black experiences of Blackness. I think if it was a genuine sort of drive to actually represent sort of the multifaceted nature of history, we would hear a lot more about sort of Asian History Month, about different kinds of ethnic groups history months, which we don't hear about at all. And I think it is because of the politicalization of this concept of Blackness in Britain, and of course, I think as an import from the US particularly.
I think that point about it being, yeah, no, I agree. I think it's such an important point. And on that political point, which I want to get people's thoughts on, I've been looking at some of the Black history lists that have come out in the last couple of weeks. So there was one, you may not have seen it, it's fine, but there was one in the Independent written by their race correspondent Nadine White. And not basically no one that was even mildly critical of identity politics or on the centre right were on that list. There's Black people of all political persuasions, but I just found it really ironic that one of the most prominent and powerful Black women in Britain right now, Kemi Badenoch, for example, was not on the list of Black trailblazers. And it's there's so many times when you have people like Trevor Phillips, there's lots of other just major Black figures that are somewhat critical of contemporary anti-racism, or somewhat critical of the direction of travel of the race commentary, and that would just mean that you're out of those lists. So how is it really celebrating Black people when it's actually to be on that list or to be recognized by lots of the people that push it? You have to think a certain way. You have to actually, be a certain way. That's not really celebrating Black people.
Yeah, it contributes to that, gatekeeping idea of, the so-called Black community, and your Blackness is sort of validated by the views that you have. And that's, I think, the wrong thing about a lot of these initiatives that are centered around race, and in particularly the race of the Black identity, right? And if you look at a lot of the literature, just go back, every single year of Black history and the themes and the people that have been celebrated, a lot of language is centered around what? Resistance. This person resisted, right? It's that kind of the struggle and this kind of language, rather than, and it sends this wrong message that enacting change is just about sort of going out and protesting or resisting, rather than kind of, exuding a good character, kind of being consistent in your work, building yourself, cultivating a mindset, that allows you to achieve against all odds, shall we say. For example, when you read about figures that are even included in some of these lists, let's say, who did I see about? I think Dido Bell. And, she has a remarkable story, right? A mixed race woman that was here in the 1700s. And a lot of, she lived an aristocratic life, but a lot of the language was still centered around her struggle and everything like that. And even, her uncle-in-law or whatever didn't focus on that. He focused on her achievement, her character, a graceful kind of demeanor that she had. So I think a lot of the language and the ideology, around a lot of these things is completely, unhelpful.
I think that goes to the point that you were making, Patience, about almost projecting contemporary obsessions with race onto the past. And you were making that point as well, Kidology, that a lot of these people in the past didn't fundamentally see themselves as, in the racial terms that we see today. And we are projecting that onto the past oftentimes, and that actually often just functions to obscure the complexities of their stories, because we can only engage with them on a racial lens. And I think that, what is everyone's thoughts on race? I think that's a kind of good place to go, because you said the kind of so-called Black community, Ada. I don't know what everyone thinks in terms of their relationship to race. Like, do they self-identify as Black, as a Black woman, or is it not something that comes into your head? Do you feel an affinity to whatever it means to be in a Black community? It'll be interesting to know what everyone thinks. What about you, Patience?
I personally think the whole idea of Black pride, or being proud to be Black, is something that doesn't really make. It's not that it doesn't make sense in Britain, but it's just not something I interact with often. It seems to be more of a US idea. You know, when I'm talking with my friends, like if they were ever going to say they're proud to be something, they'd say they're proud to be Nigerian, or they're proud to be Ghanaian, or they'd claim pride in their tribe. And it's same with me. Like I don't ever think to myself, I'm proud to be Black. You know, I think about my ethnic heritage, my ethnic tribe, my culture, because to me, the word Black doesn't mean anything, because it's just a skin color. It doesn't really tell me much about you, or tell me much about your culture or anything like that. And I think that does come from the fact that as an African person, you know, like being proud to be Black isn't really something that you hear much from Africans. It's normally, you know, they take pride in their ethnic heritage or their tribe or whatever. So I don't feel Black pride or feel proud to be Black or anything, because to me that's quite an ambiguous thing to say. And I don't think I don't believe in the Black community. Because we're so diverse, especially here in Britain, you know, Black people in Britain come from different parts of the world. Many of us are first, second generation immigrants. So we come with our own identity, our own values, our own cultural background, etc. So there may be some similarities between us, but ultimately we're not exactly the same. And so the idea that we're some monolithic community, I think just doesn't make any sense, especially when you consider there's a big difference between us and Caribbeans as well. So there's a big difference amongst Africans, and then there's also a difference as well amongst Caribbeans as well. So I just think the idea of saying that there is a Black community doesn't make any sense, because even if you take it away from ethnic lines, there's a big difference between a working class Black person and a middle class Black person. You know, there's difference in terms of their experiences, there's differences in terms of how they navigate the world and the opportunities that they'll have, etc. So what is the Black community? I think that there's a Black demographic, but I don't believe that there is a singular Black community. I think there's multiple Black communities. So when you say the Black community, I don't know who you're talking to. I don't know who you're referring to with that statement. I just think Black is just, I don't know what it's the same as saying white, right? But there's a big difference between Polish people and English people, and there's a big difference, and Scottish people, etc. So like these white and Black, even Asian, there's a big difference between Chinese people and Indian people. So who are we talking about when we use these very ambiguous like terms? It's just my opinion. I'm very happy to scrap the race in general and use ethnicities. I know that's like probably a bit more of a radical position, but I'd be happy if especially when it comes to things like statistics. When I see statistics and I just see Black, I don't like that. I want to know who you're talking about, because as we know already, even with just the education system alone, there's a very big difference between the outcomes of Black Caribbeans versus Black African students. So it's not very helpful to anyone to use these blanket terms, because I need to know who you're talking about, who you're referring to when you talk about this stuff. And that's just my personal opinion.
No, I think that's so interesting. No, that's not radical to us. One of the first articles that I wrote on race was we need to abolish race. So this is but it'll be interesting to hear what you think, Kidology, because I've said some of these things, and I've had some Caribbean Black British people of Caribbean heritage essentially say to me that, you know, as someone that's of Nigerian heritage and a child of someone that came you know, in the post-war years later, that's a privileged position for me to say, because I've benefited from the struggles of primarily Black Caribbeans, you know, in the Windrush era, that they didn't have that choice to say, actually, you know, I'm going to emphasize my ethnicity, or, you know, we need to do away with race, because they were subject to racism in Britain. And so it was a way to, you know, it was an identity that people retreated in as a way to, you know, seek comfort or whatever, for understandable reasons. So I guess my question is that is it coming from a place of privilege? Are we saying that because we've now moved on and we don't experience the same things that maybe people did, and they took respite in race?
I don't think it comes from a place of privilege. I think that is just an inevitable consequence of the passage of time. I think that, you know, nobody chooses when they are born or what context and circumstances they are born into. I think that there's definitely a place for like sort of self-awareness about why you are in your situation and sort of, you know, why you think the way that you think in your context and time period. But I don't think that it's necessarily about sort of privilege and being oblivious to history and not being self-aware about these things. I think that sort of just with the passage of time, I think that this context is now perfectly appropriate to actually have these conversations about centering ethnicity over that of race. I don't think that does a disservice to Windrush or to generations preceding us, but yes, I think that just represents a kind of progress or a progression of the passage of time. So yes, I completely agree with sort of this idea of moving away from race in defining our existence collectively and looking at ethnicity. I think it's perfectly apt.
And Ada, what do you think? Because so I don't identify as a member of the Black community, and I don't really identify very much with race. But at the same time, like, I did grow up on a lot of African American TV shows, African American music. I listened to lots of Afro beats. I listened to a lot of jazz, and sometimes when I'm feeling nostalgic about when I was a teenager, I'll listen to Grime or something like that. So I guess my question is, even in a way, like there's always that tension that even if we don't, that the Black community in a way exists, like there is something, and maybe you can't really put it into words. And some people might say that the challenge is not so much to do away with the Blackness as such, but to always keep it flexible and open. And maybe we've got too much the other direction where it's like rigid. And that's something that I'm torn on. What do you think?
Yeah, I somewhat agree. And I think these things are not harmful if they respect the individual in a person. So you mentioned that you don't identify with the Black community. The reason I don't identify with the Black community is very simple, because I don't feel like I'm free to say, or I am free and I say what I want to say, but it's not without sort of, this kind of message that I'm not so-called Black, right? So if being Black means I have to say certain things and see life in a certain way, then that's when I think that this idea of the Black community needs to be, stopped, in my opinion. If it's just about music and, fashion styles and food tastes and, and all this and that, that's fine. Even if you want to name it the Black community or Black culture, I have no problem with this. But I have a problem when it comes to ideas of people and policing how people should think, and more precisely, how people should see the world, how people should react to things, and moreover, how people should react to their own experiences, right? We love to talk about lived experiences until we're blue in the face. And yet when someone that doesn't subscribe to a certain narrative, that becomes, well, what's the E word? You're an exception. Well, that's an anomaly. Well, if I'm so-called part of the Black community, then why doesn't my experience contribute? Why doesn't my idea contribute to the conversation? So that has always been my issue with all of this. There's no problem with groups. There's not even a problem with racial categories. The problem is also the categorization of people's thoughts and ideas. And then that means that, contrary thinking outside of that, it's not even a sense of being criticized. Criticism is fine, but it comes with the fact that you are not the identity, right? That you are portraying yourself as, or you're claiming to be, just because you don't align with certain views. That's my only problem with it.
Yeah.
I
would
think
also say, sorry, go ahead.
Go for it.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I see where you're coming from in regards to, like, if we completely get rid of the Black community, are we going too far in the one direction where people don't kind of feel as though they have kind of like a unifying thing to, I guess, belong to in some way? But I also, I wouldn't mind having like a different alternative. I just don't like the idea of calling it a community, because the traditional understanding of the word community is the idea that people share a value system, they share something connects them, and which is why you could call like your church, for example, your community, because likely you have the same values, you follow, based around your religion or whatever. You could call even the area you live a community, because you all live in the same area, you're going to share similar kind of experiences on that basis. The idea of having a Black community implies that the only thing that connects us is our skin color. And I think that's like one of the things that I have with the idea of a Black community, because what do you have in common just by being Black, aside from just your skin color? Because we are so vastly different. And I think because when you call it a community, that's what leads to the stuff that Ada's describing, where people now think you have to think a certain way, you have to talk a certain way, you have to dress or do your hair a certain way, or you have to behave a certain way, you have to have certain politics. Because if you're saying something as a community, you're implying that you're supposed to be cohesive, you're supposed to be, in line with each other, you're supposed to understand each other, you're supposed to agree with each other. And so I think that's what leads to this tribalistic behavior, where people now think, oh, because you're doing this, you're a traitor, or you're a sellout, or you're whatever, because the idea of community has always historically been understood as a group of people who were unified on values and beliefs and all those core principles. So when you make it a Black community and you just but the only thing that unifies us is the color of our skin, that's how I think you end up with all this gatekeeping and all this micromanaging of people's behaviors. And so I think I wouldn't mind having something else, which is why I say there's no Black community. There's a Black demographic and there's multiple Black communities. But I think I just don't think it can work if you view it as a community, because I think that's what leads to all this other behavior that Ada's described.
But just a question then, what people would say, oh, sorry. No, just because she said, well, what do we have in common apart from the fact that we're Black? But then you would always have someone say, well, what we have in common is that we're going to be, or we are victims of racism, whether you know it or not. Historically, we've been brutalized, marginalized, dehumanized, like you mentioned, the barriers against us. So whether we like it or not, and this is the phrase that's often used, you may not identify or see yourself as Black, but that's how they see us. That's how the society sees us, right?
It's interesting because Thomas Chatterton Williams, he's his book Self-Portrait in Black and White, and it's about transcending race, and he gives a really good example because he's a fairer skinned African American man, and he has lived for the last few years in Paris. And in Paris, he's often perceived of as an Arab person. And he, in response to that argument, he says, well, should I then see myself as an Arab just because loads of people in France view him as an Arab, and because he may be a victim of racism on the basis of being perceived of as an Arab? So, and obviously we would all say no. And I think that's a very good counter argument that why should you see yourself in the eyes of those who hate you? Just because a racist might think a certain way about me, that doesn't mean that I then embrace the identity of how racists see me. So I don't really buy the argument when people say, oh, well, even if you don't identify with the term Black, you're still going to be a victim of racism and other people are going to see you that way, because I don't define myself in that way.
Yeah. No, I would agree, because you could say that about everything. There are some racist people who never view you as British because of the fact that you're Black or whatever. Like, even though you are British, they'll easily say, well, you're not British because you're not an indigenous person to this land. So it's like, if we're going to go with that, then should we just scrap out any any identity to this country altogether. Like, so now you can't identify as even that. So I just don't think, I agree, I just don't think you should define yourself by people who dislike you, because otherwise, where does it end? At what point do you stop doing that? If you're going to start there, why not do that with other things as well?
There's a question that, because this kind of brings me on to the question, like, and by the way, people that are listening, I see that there's like some questions and stuff, like we're going to go to Q&A very soon, so make sure you get your questions in. But I just want to ask one more question before we go to the Q&A and stuff. Why do you think, I don't know if other people think that this is the discussion that we're having is still a minority view. I suspect it's a sizable but probably a minority view amongst Black folk in Britain. And why do you think that that is the case, maybe, or at least how it's portrayed in the media and certain circles online, that those that argue that we should go beyond race, that we shouldn't define ourselves by race, and that we're much more than that, we're complex as human beings, etc., is still it feels like it's a minority view. What do you think, Kidology?
I think that it makes perfect sense, just based on, I think, it's sort of key thing of sort of the internet, and I guess sort of the breakdown of traditional communities and traditional sort of experiences. Everybody's life doesn't really go in this sort of homogenous trajectory that, I mean, even 20, 30 odd years ago, people's lives generally followed sort of the same sort of script and narrative based on their sort of community and even their racial community in a way. I think we're just exposed to so much more and so much more factors of our identity and exploring our identity that it's impossible to even, I think, just reconcile the term identity politics. It's just a juxtaposition. Sort of politics is about sort of community and coming together, and identity is such an individual and personal thing that I think it inevitably just leads to the kind of failure and exclusion which seemingly identity politics and all of this inclusivity is meant to counteract. So I think that it makes sense to sort of move beyond this and to move beyond sort of this idea of race in this day and age. And like you said, I do think it's a minority view, but I do think that if people with sort of, I guess, sort of the anomaly experiences are sort of able to be platformed, are able to voice their experiences. I think, for instance, like I was raised by white people, lived with white people, considered myself white for a very long time until I've sort of looked in a mirror and realized, oh my gosh. I think if sort of those things, and I think those things are going to become a lot more common just with the way that the world is going. I think that we may see sort of people starting to consider this as sort of a way to move forward, because right now what we're doing, it's just leading to a lot of infighting, a lot more resentment, a lot of sort of anti-white racism to sort of explain everything that seemingly is not being resolved by the current path that we're on. So yes, I do have hope for the future of this, but yes.
Does anyone want to say some other comments on that question before we go to some of the Q&A?
Minority view. Do you know what? I always wonder when I see people saying that this is like a minority view among Black people, I'm always curious just how true that actually is, because I think it's not like an unknown fact that there are a lot of people within certain groups that have views and opinions that they would never dare to say out loud because of the kind of like things that come their way, just because if you don't follow a very, very specific reductive script on the basis of your skin color, then, you know, people start calling you all kinds of names. If you're a woman, then you'll be compared to Candace Owens, because I guess people don't know any other Black woman who doesn't kind of follow these like mainstream views except for Candace Owens. So I think it's like So I am quite suspicious about just how much of a minority some of these views are, because when I talk to people in real life, and when I talk to other Black people in real life, a lot of them do agree with a lot of this stuff. They just don't have the time to get into arguments about it with people by saying them out loud, so just kind of keep them to themselves. But I think a lot of people, you know, especially I think here, I think a lot of people don't really truly believe their skin color really holds them back, because if they did, they wouldn't really work as hard to go to university and to pursue all these things and to aspire for stuff. I see loads of Black successful people all the time within my own family, within my friends and around me. So clearly they had the idea that they could go out and accomplish things, otherwise they wouldn't have been there in the first place. So I don't think that people really truly always believe the struggle narrative, but I think that sometimes it is a useful thing to fall back on if things don't work out the way you wanted them to. But yeah, I'm just skeptical of just how many people actually how much of a minority this view actually is all I'm saying. I feel like it's probably a lot more popular than we realize, but people just can't be bothered to argue over it, so just keep it to themselves.
Yeah, I think so definitely. Yeah, sorry, no, you go.
No, I was just going to say that like all of my Nigerian family agree with me. And I often hear that I do think there's a lot of particularly recent immigrants, they emphasize, as you mentioned, education, personal responsibility, certain values, which on the basis kind of indicates that they do believe that individuals can like transcend their circumstances and so on. And I do think that is a fair point. But what are you going to say, Ada?
No, it was just quickly to say that I think with certain groups, subgroups, shall we say, within the Black community, I think it will be difficult for them to sort of latch onto this idea because their identity is built on that. And this has meaning for them, right? You know, different Black community, different groups, subgroups within the Black community have different histories, right? The Caribbean community group has, you know, different history to so maybe Nigerians and so on. So I think it just depends on how much meaning you attach to these things. Me personally, like many of yourselves, you know, from when you're in Africa, this is, you know, what people also need to not get confused about is that there is identity politics, I think, in Africa, just in a different way, right? In terms of maybe religion, your tribe, but obviously not on race, right? So what I'm trying to say is that maybe to some people hearing getting rid of race could be saying to an African person, well, let's get rid of tribes kind of thing. Like that's all some people know. But I think more and more people are realizing that if they're not free, right, to express themselves, not only in thought, not only in how to think or in terms of ideas, but even in lifestyle choices or hobbies. You know, I remember growing up, this was a very real thing for me. And this was before this whole identity politics thing blew up. You know, I was told I wasn't Black on many occasions for quite trivial things like not even being loud. And it's so ironic to me when I hear people say, no, Black people are told to quieten down. Well, I wasn't told to quieten down. I was told that I was too quiet, right? Because that's how I kind of learned in my family to not speak when adults are speaking. And I came to Britain and I was like, everyone's speaking kind of thing. So once because that's what happened to me, I started to realize that actually I'm not free. I'm always being told how to think, how to act, what I can like, what I can't like, right? And I think once people start to realize, they'll understand or see that perhaps it's not a community, right? If you're not allowed to be free to be yourself, it's more like a cult, right? It's not a community. So once people start to realize that, then naturally you see themselves distance themselves from it. And like all things, this becomes sort of standard in culture and society.
Do you notice that it's always the bad things though? Like what you're saying, Ada, you said people said you weren't Black because you weren't loud. You know, like I've been told that I sound white because of the way I talk. Like it's always bad things, right? I even saw someone saying that it's racist to say to promote the nuclear family because it's like it's for some reason that's a white concept. You know, I've seen some people say it's a white concept to eat 3 meals a day, and there was
punctuality. I've heard punctuality.
Yeah, punctuality is also white. It's always the things that are actually good for people apparently are anti-black. And I just find that to be really interesting, because it's almost as if like you're socially conditioning Black people to do all the things that are bad for them. And if they actually dare to like break outside the mold and try and, it's like I've seen even Black Americans say that they get bullied in school if they actually take their education seriously. Now, as an African, that blows my mind, because I can't even imagine, you know, I can't even imagine the idea of like being cool for not taking your education seriously. I think because a lot of us, it's drilled into our heads that you will be good in school by force, by fire. So it's just such a weird idea that someone would be given like negative feedback for being like smart in school or taking their education seriously. But the kind of things that are celebrated, the kinds of things that actually do, even when you see like rappers and stuff and how they feel as though they have to present themselves in a certain way, otherwise they're not really Black. Didn't something like that happen with Drake, where they said he wasn't like a real because he comes from like a more privileged background or something like that? It's always the bad stuff. I find that really interesting, how it's the bad characteristics that people say, yes, if you do that, then you're Black. But if you're on time, if you're not loud, if you speak properly, then oh no, you're not really being Black. So it's like it's very interesting. It's like everyone's trying to set each other up for failure in a way. I find it really bizarre how it's always the bad characteristics that make you more Black, but if you do things that are actually good for you, then suddenly you're not Black. Like how a nuclear family is somehow a white concept is just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the people who say these things, like the commentators who say these things, are actually individuals who live the complete antithesis. They have a nuclear family, or they are the patriarch of like a family with children, and it sort of is they promoting these, I guess, these like sort of luxury beliefs to other people. And it's very interesting when you look into their own personal histories, their own sort of life stories, how it's the complete opposite of what they say is good for everybody else. So yeah,
feed other people poison whilst you don't take it, basically.
Yes.
Let them all kind of struggle with the consequences while you continue to have your comfortable life. It's quite bad.
It's sad.
It's so true. We need to go to the Q&A, but just one quick point on that point you just made, Kidology. I just think it's so true, because I often think that it's actually often the most like upper middle class, like, and fair play to them, good for them. We want more Black upper middle class people, but it's often like I also see like upper middle class Black people that kind of bang on about a lot of this stuff the most as well. And I'm like, this is kind of strange that your lives are very, very disconnected from like a lot of the Black people in the lower socioeconomic status, that personal responsibility, working hard, these are great things that will help everybody succeed. But all of a sudden, these things, we shouldn't really talk about these things. But yeah, let's go to the Q&A. So we have from Anne, who says, is there a danger of critical theory, critical gender, and critical tribal theory being weaponized against successful African groups in Africa and in England? That's an interesting one. I'll go through a few questions. We don't actually have loads of time, so we can kind of pick up on ones that we think about. Question for the panel: how often do you all get challenged on your views vigorously? Genuine pushback and not an echo chamber. And Shukri has said something that is similar to what we were discussing. Should we define ourselves by how racists see us? You know, that's exactly what we talked about. And there's another comment saying that, you know, basically, should we be talking about beauty privilege? You know, is that something that is a factor that we're not thinking about? So let's start with the question about whether some of these theories are being weaponized against successful African groups. And, you know, I think this is a really good point, just very quickly. There's a really good book by this guy called Olufemi Taiwo called Against Decolonisation, Taking African Agency Seriously. And he essentially argues that a lot of these kind of theories about decolonisation are essentially taking agency away from African people in Africa to take responsibility for their own societies and governments, and essentially because everything's just being blamed on like Western groups. And actually, there's something very patronizing and condescending and against agency when you see everything through the framework of oppressor versus oppressed. It's all due to white racism. So I do think there is a danger that it can actually impact people's sense of their own direction of their own lives. I don't know if other people have thoughts or counter arguments.
Oh, I would personally. So no, go, because I was going to say, Z, I saw a tweet you put up about South Africa, so I was wondering if you were gonna.
Oh, right. Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I completely agree. I think that critical theory, and an example of South Africa is sort of what you were saying about how these theories are used to ultimately justify not actually doing the work or initiating change yourself as a people or a society, but just blaming it on the colonizers or on the white sort of scapegoat, which is what has happened in South Africa for the last over 20 years, just blaming white people. And then it's very convenient for sort of a Black elite to emerge, to be as corrupt as ever, and to blame all of that on just the legacy of apartheid, or in the general sort of African continent, the legacy of colonialism. And I think that whenever that argument is used, I can't help but sort of roll my eyes, because I mean, human history is a history of colonizing and conquering. Like, that's sort of, you can't just go as far back as you want to. Otherwise, you go back to, I mean, in South Africa, sort of the Khoisan are the original sort of Southern Africans, and so not the Zulus, who think that South Africa is theirs and the land is theirs. And so I think it's always, the history of colonialism is a very politicized history that only goes so far back and is used to justify, I think, just being complacent and not actually trying to build together as a nation and as a people, and being proud of your future rather than looking at your past as one of struggle and oppression. I don't think that helps anybody.
Yeah, I would say that that's oh, sorry, no, go.
No, I just think the same level of morality doesn't seem to be applied to sort of, let's say, African countries, you know, especially when you see, you know, there's levels of corruption everywhere. We don't need to sort of mince words with that. But I don't know if you guys have perceived this trend of, you know, if it's a Black country, or, you know, if it's a Black person that does something, it's kind of played down, or it's like, okay, that's kind of down to the culture, or that's kind of how it is. But, you know, if it's a white country, then it becomes, well, this is innately their brutal, you know, self and things like that. And when you look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, for example, you know, that always literally ranks the lowest or the highest, depending on how they measure it, on the corruption index. And you have, you know, students not having electricity to study, and yet, you know, mansions and, you know, the palaces are being sort of lit up fully to the brim with electricity. It just makes you think, like, little things like that. And, you know, when I came to this country and I would hear this narrative of, you know, it's Black people might struggle because of their skin color and they live in a racist society. And I was like, people struggle everywhere. Like, do you want to travel? People struggle everywhere. Life itself is a struggle. So I didn't buy into this thing that racism is my biggest barrier, because I've lived in a country where there's so-called no racism, and there was still, you know, the struggle to survive, the struggle to be the best, struggle, you know, well, you know, the need to survive and be the best. And it's the exact same mindset I applied here. And that's why I say, you know, racism will be solved, I think, or this kind of victim mentality will be solved if people just traveled a bit more. I had a friend, and she had that mindset of sort of Pan-Africanism, and, you know, everything that the West has done is evil and Africa is innocent. And then she traveled to Africa, and she traveled to Ghana, shall I say. And yeah, we had a live, it's one of the first lives I did on my channel. And she said, just seeing kind of the reality that, you know, being, you know, in a country that, you know, it's 99.9% Black, and the same issues still arise there of discrimination, you know, of alienation, exclusion, difficulty in finding opportunities as well. It's universal, it's everywhere. And I think just making it a so-called white thing or European thing, I think it's, like you mentioned, is so disempowering, and so, you know, it removes that, you know, that agency from Black people and Black countries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think as well, blaming everything on colonialism doesn't make sense, because there are countries that were colonized and are doing great, like Singapore is a good example of that. And it's so, and I also think the problem I have is, while I completely understand and I appreciate the idea of looking back at history to understand the present, because I see, like, you know, a lot of time people want to go back and talk about all these historical events and stuff. My problem is, you can't change history, so at what point do we like move forward from that? Because we can look back at history all day long and just continue to like look back and say, oh, but this happened, but you can't change it. That's never not going to not have happened. So at what point do you move forward and try and do better and build better? And like I said, other countries have done that. Rwanda's economy is also improving. There's plenty of examples of people who've had similar history, but they've started to improve because they've chosen to look forward rather than stay focused on what's happened in the past and what's happened in history. At some point, people have to move on. And I think whenever you say that, people think you're being very like inconsiderate and you're being very dismissive, but it's not really it's not being dismissive. It's like, you have to sometimes acknowledge that things happen in the past, but at some point, you know, you do have to move forward. If someone pushes you on the floor, it's their fault you're on the floor, but if they come back 2 weeks later and you're still on the floor, that was a choice. You know, at some point you do have to get up. So that's kind of my opinion on that.
It's so true. You know, you mentioned Singapore, you know, look at India now. You know, when we were all younger, you know, the primary stories coming out of India was that it was this, you know, really poor country, and you know, now they're on the economic rise, and that's what we want for all, you know, former colonial countries that were colonized. And I think you've got to look forward. As you said, what else is the alternative? So we don't actually have that much time left, so we haven't been able to go to all of the questions. But I think we can. But I also think it's partly because we don't often actually get an opportunity to just like speak openly about all these issues, and so often people speak for different groups and different ethnicities, and that's kind of why we're doing this, because actually there's lots of different perspectives out there. I guess I'll end with this final question. It says, which I mentioned before, how often does everyone get challenged like for their views? Like, do you feel that you know, why did everyone decide to actually start talking about these issues, start commenting on them, and what's been the response everybody has got from, whether that's from like British culture more broadly or Black people specifically? So we'll start with you, Kidology.
Well, my audience is primarily American, so the response has not been so good. And so it is, I do find it tricky to talk about, but I think with time and confidence, that's definitely started to improve for me. I think also because I'm South African and I also reach a South African audience, my views on South Africa are very unpopular. So I do definitely, this conversation resonates with me greatly on that. But yes, I think I do understand what Ada was saying about sort of people not having the freedom to sort of talk about these things, or not feeling that they do, especially I would say young people and people who aren't sort of online all the time speaking about these issues like I am. It's definitely been a matter of confidence and just not caring what sort of the response is going to be, and just being sort of honest or true to myself, I guess. But yes, I think the tide will change. People are sort of starting to realize that a lot of these explanations for things regarding race don't add up. They're not adding up. The sort of promised future of living in this like sort of, I guess, post-racial sort of time, it just has not been realized through these particular methods and way of censoring and policing people's identity and language on these things. And so I think there is definitely sort of a hole or a gap that needs filling. And I think that sort of people who sort of are going to speak a bit more openly about this, I think that sort of the time is coming around. Yeah.
I think that's so true. Ada, what do you think? What's been the response, and why did you start expressing these views?
For me, it was very simple. The narrative did not match my reality. So I was seeing a lot of things. I come from a high up middle class family in Nigeria, and in Nigeria itself, you know, we did very well. I lacked nothing. You know, we had huge houses, cars, and all these things. And when I came here, the story didn't change. And so hearing this narrative about Black people and, you know, a lot of kind of, you know, things about our mindset, things about being victimized, things about not being, the biggest one for me was the privilege word, the privilege language. And I was by default not privileged. And it was like, that is such, like, I love the word Kidology used. It was an antithesis to my own lived, and then they talk about lived experience, but they weren't respecting my own experience. And it didn't mean that I didn't face, you know, issues like everyone else. I don't need to give this disclaimer all the time, you know, but I believe that I had a good privileged life. And I even saying it now, I'm kind of stuttering because it's like, it's so difficult, or it seems difficult for a Black person to be able to admit this. And why is it that you have celebrities, Black celebrities, well accomplished Black people? Why can't they just say that they had a good upbringing? They lived in a great place. You know, why does it have to come with, well, that's why, you know, Black Lives Matter? Why do you have to do all that? Like, it's okay to own your experience. And I couldn't own my experience. It doesn't mean I stand for racism or I water down racism or I ignore racism. No, I don't, because these things are a reality for everyone, by the way, regardless of their race. And that was the other thing, this kind of particularizing quite universal common experiences to just being sort of a Black experience. You know, how does it make sense to say that I struggle because I'm Black and my white friend or colleague will not struggle because they're white, and the opposite things were happening? So I just felt that not speaking was me lying or contributing to a lie at least. And to cut a long story short, I actually couldn't sleep well at night until I spoke out. And I knew that a lot of other people were in that prison and that cage of, this is not my reality and I'm not going to be silent about it.
What about you, Patience?
Do I get pushback? Well, I'm on YouTube, so of course, you know, pushback comes with the territory. I think I do like Kidology. I mostly get pushback from Black Americans. I don't really. My audience is quite diverse in terms of where people come from, but it is usually Black Americans I do get the pushback from. And I think that's probably just more so because this kind of stuff is a lot more of a thing over there. And so I think a lot of the time, especially when it comes to Black Americans and Americans in general, really, I think sometimes they think that we're all Americans with funny accents. So, you know, when they see us, they don't really register the fact that we are from completely different countries with completely different, you know, structures and stuff, with completely different cultures and all that kind of stuff. So they expect us to still repeat the same Black American talking points that they're used to. And so naturally, you know, you are going to get pushback when you're not saying things from the Black American perspective, because that's what they expect you to hear. Even though you don't sound like an American and you're not from America. So I think sometimes I think it's like a cultural differences and stuff, and just not understanding that some of their views just don't really make sense over here, even though we still insist on importing them anyway. But I would agree. I think similar to Ada, it's hard for me to accept this narrative because of the fact that everything about my life experience just completely contradicts it. You know, I was someone who was born into poverty in Zimbabwe. I didn't start with privilege whatsoever. You know, I've experienced what it's like to not have basic things. And I was privileged enough to witness my mom start from there and build herself into being really successful, and to get to watch her and my parents now, her and my stepfather, continue to build together. From a young age, I was raised to believe that, you know, I had to make the best out of the opportunities in this country, because the opportunities that are here don't exist in other parts of the world, definitely not where I was born. So it's like, so I think growing up with that attitude, and then obviously I never really felt the need to hold myself back because of my skin color, because that's not a seed that my parents ever planted into my head. And so I think it's quite interesting, because I was having a conversation about this with my friend, and she said she forgets she's Black until she goes online. And I think that kind of really highlights how this kind of stuff is really more online centric in terms of where you get these messages from, because when you're just going through the world, you don't really think about your skin color or the fact that you're a Black woman or any of these things. It's just kind of more something that's really focused on the internet and on social media. Now you become this Black woman, you know, you are part of this Black struggle. But in your day-to-day life, you know, if you're going into a workplace or something, no one's asking, you know, how is the Black struggle or something like that. So although one of my friends actually did say that, an old white man actually did come up to her and say, I just want to let you know your life does matter. And this was during like the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think we've kind of put some white people in a weird position where they now think they have to affirm that they accept that, you know, we that they see us and we have rights and stuff. I think the whole thing is just making some people a bit weird. But even if you do get pushback, I just want to say, if anyone's watching this now and you're one of the people who's kind of uncomfortable speaking your mind and saying whatever you want, like, I honestly do think it's still worth saying, because I think the only reason why people get pushback is because not enough people speak and not enough people vocalize their opinions. Like I was saying before, I'm skeptical of the idea that these views are really that much of a minority, because when you speak to people in one-on-one, they don't really hold these like really activisty views and stuff like that. They don't believe that they're going to be held back because of the color of their skin. They've got big ambitions and big goals of what they want to do. And so I think and I get tons and tons of messages on Instagram from Black people telling me how they're so happy to see a young person who shares their perspective because they're not used to seeing it, and all this other kind of stuff. So I think you feel like a minority because not a lot of people are speaking, but I don't think that's the reality. I think it's going to take more people to actually just be honest and just say what they think, for people to start feeling more comfortable to talk about it, and then maybe you get less pushback. And I'm sorry for taking up so much time, but yeah.
No, great answers, guys. I'll just answer very quickly. I'm not primarily on YouTube, obviously. Like, the main way that I comment is like in the media and stuff. And I would say that overwhelmingly the response I get is actually positive. And like a lot of British people are just like so relieved, because they're just like, they know intuitively a lot of what is said is like not their own experience, you know, that whether that they're in like mixed race relationships, they've lived and grown up with, you know, around Black and ethnic minority people their whole life, and all of a sudden like you've got primarily like middle and upper class liberal white folk, you know, just saying that they're racist for just like merely existing, and they're just like thankful that someone is just saying something that they don't feel confident to say themselves. I get a lot of positive responses from like West Africans that live in West Africa, which I find somewhat strange.
I get a lot of positive. Yeah, I was gonna say I get a lot of positive feedback from Africans, a lot, like, because I do have South Africans and people from like other parts of like continental Africans as well who follow me. I get a lot of positive feedback from them. I get a lot of positive feedback from British people as well. It is just mainly just a very specific group and it's not just Black Americans, it's just Americans in general, to be honest, because even white Americans, the like kind of like leftist types also have a big issue with my views as well. But I think it is just yeah, I think it's a very specific set of people with a certain political ideology. And I think some of it is to do with the fact that I think some of it is also to do with the fact that they think that you're supposed to have a certain set of views and political views because, you know, I guess they think that you have to automatically be on their team and on their side just because of your immutable characteristics. And so I think they kind of sometimes feel like they have to remind you of where you're supposed to be. So
yeah, I kind of just, the people that call me, you know, race traitor, all this kind of stuff, it's honestly water off a duck's back. I genuinely do not care what those people say, because if you think that like advocating for, you know, actually realizing a multiracial society that isn't defined by race, talking about, you know, community and personal responsibility, education, other social values that contribute to success, is somehow against Black people, then that's on you. You know, that's your cross to bear. But yeah, I think we have come to the end, guys. I know there's so much more that we could talk about, because it's such a big and meaty subject. Everyone's got so many interesting and important contributions. But I just want to say thank you so much to you all for being on this roundtable discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for to everybody who tuned in and asked questions and paid attention. And as I said, we will link everybody's blogs and YouTube channels and Twitters and work in the description box. So please follow everybody's work for more fascinating, important, and insightful contributions. So good night, everyone.
Thank you.
thank you.